My name is Thomas Hartwell, and I've been farming this land for 37 years, just like my father before me and his father before him. The Hartwell family has worked these 120 acres since 1887, when my great-grandfather Samuel first planted the apple trees that would become our pride and joy. Those trees weren't just crops to us. They were living monuments to 4 generations of sweat, sacrifice, and stubborn determination. The orchard sprawled across 15 acres of the most fertile soil in the county, with varieties ranging from classic Red Delicious to heritage apples that most people had never heard of. Every spring, when those trees burst into bloom, the entire valley looked like something out of a fairy tale. Tourists would drive for hours just to walk through our rows and breathe in the sweet perfume of apple blossoms. But what made our farm truly special wasn't visible to most visitors. Hidden beneath decades of careful cultivation was an intricate water management system that my great-grandfather had engineered with nothing but determination and a basic understanding of hydraulics. He'd diverted a portion of Miller's Creek to flow through our property, creating a network of channels and irrigation ditches that kept our land green even during the worst droughts. The system was so subtle, so perfectly integrated into the natural landscape, that most people never realized it existed. Water flowed quietly through underground pipes and stone-lined channels, emerging in carefully placed locations to nourish not just our orchard, but the entire ecosystem that had grown up around it. When the Willowbrook Estates development started creeping closer to our property line 5 years ago, I wasn't particularly worried. We'd been good neighbors to everyone who'd ever lived nearby, and I assumed the new residents would appreciate having a working farm next door. I couldn't have been more wrong about what was coming. Chapter 2. The New Neighbors. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a perfectly manicured woman named Patricia Thornfield, who introduced herself as the president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. She arrived at my front door on a Tuesday morning in early spring, dressed in a white pantsuit that probably cost more than I spent on farm equipment in a month. Patricia's smile was as artificial as the flowers in her perfectly landscaped front yard, and her voice carried the kind of condescending tone that city folks often used when talking to farmers. She explained that the HOA had received numerous complaints about the unsightly agricultural activities taking place adjacent to their community. According to Patricia, my orchard was bringing down property values. The sight of working farm equipment, the smell of organic fertilizer, and the presence of bees were all considered nuisances by the residents of Willowbrook Estates. She had the audacity to suggest that I consider selling my land to a developer who could put it to better use. I listened politely to her concerns, then explained that my family had been farming this land for over a century, long before her subdivision existed. I pointed out that we followed all agricultural regulations and had never received any official complaints from the county. Patricia's smile grew even more strained as I spoke, and I could see the calculation in her eyes. She left that day with a warning disguised as friendly advice. "Times change, Mr. Hartwell. Sometimes it's better to adapt voluntarily than to be forced to change later." I should have taken that threat more seriously. Within a week, I started receiving official notices from various county departments. Suddenly, my farm was being inspected for code violations that had never existed before. My irrigation system was questioned, my equipment storage was deemed inadequate, and my century-old farmhouse was cited for aesthetic incompatibility with the surrounding neighborhood. The war had begun, and I didn't even realize I was fighting yet. Chapter 3. The Legal Assault. The HOA's strategy became clear over the following months. They couldn't force me to sell my land directly, but they could make farming it so expensive and difficult that I'd have no choice but to give up. The legal documents started arriving weekly, each one more aggressive than the last. First came the noise ordinances. Apparently, my tractor was too loud for the delicate sensibilities of Willowbrook Estates residents. Never mind that I only used it during reasonable daytime hours and had been doing so for decades without complaint. The HOA had convinced the county to implement new noise restrictions that effectively made normal farming operations illegal. Then came the water usage regulations. This was particularly galling because my irrigation system used water that flowed naturally through my property, water that had been legally diverted by my great-grandfather under territorial water rights that predated any modern regulations. But the HOA had hired expensive lawyers who specialized in finding loopholes in century-old agreements. The most devastating blow came when they challenged my property's agricultural zoning. Through a series of legal maneuvers that I still don't fully understand, they managed to get portions of my land reclassified as transitional residential, which meant I could no longer use modern farming equipment or maintain my irrigation infrastructure. Every legal challenge cost me thousands of dollars in attorney fees, money that should have been invested in maintaining and improving the farm. I watched my savings disappear into the pockets of lawyers while my orchard began to suffer from neglect. The stress was affecting my health, my marriage, and my ability to focus on the work that had sustained my family for generations. Patricia Thornfield would drive by my property regularly, always slowing down to survey the damage their legal campaign was inflicting. I could see the satisfaction in her face as my once pristine orchard began to show signs of distress. She was winning, and she knew it. But what Patricia didn't know was that I had been quietly researching the water rights situation, and I was about to discover something that would change everything. Chapter 4. The Discovery. Late one evening, while digging through boxes of family documents in my grandfather's old study, I found something that made my heart race. Hidden beneath decades of farm records and faded photographs was the original water rights agreement that my great-grandfather had negotiated with the territorial government in 1889. The document was written in the formal language of the late 19th century, but its meaning was crystal clear. Samuel Hartwell had been granted perpetual rights to divert up to 40% of Miller's Creek's flow through his property, with the understanding that this water would be used for agricultural purposes and would eventually return to the natural watershed downstream. What made this discovery so significant was a clause I had never known existed. The agreement specifically stated that any interruption of the agricultural use of the land would void the water diversion rights, and the creek would return to its original course. More importantly, any development that had been built in reliance on the diverted water would lose its water source entirely. I spent the next week tracing the path of Miller's Creek through old survey maps and aerial photographs. What I discovered was breathtaking in its implications. The entire Willowbrook Estates development had been built in what was originally the creek's natural floodplain. When my great-grandfather diverted the water through our property, he had inadvertently created the dry land that made their subdivision possible. The creek's original course ran directly through what was now the heart of Willowbrook Estates, including the exact location where they were planning to build their new luxury pool complex. If I stopped maintaining the diversion system that my family had operated for over a century, Miller's Creek would reclaim its original path within a matter of weeks. I sat in that dusty study until dawn, reading and rereading the water rights agreement, making sure I understood every legal nuance. For the first time in months, I felt something I had almost forgotten: hope. The HOA had been so focused on destroying my farm that they had never bothered to research how their own community had come to exist. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson about the importance of understanding local history. Chapter 5. The Final Straw. The HOA's ultimate betrayal came on a crisp October morning when I discovered a fleet of bulldozers parked along my property line. Patricia Thornfield stood nearby with a group of contractors, pointing at my orchard and discussing their plans with the casual indifference of people who had never grown anything more challenging than lawn grass. I approached the group with growing dread, already knowing what I was about to hear. Patricia's smile was triumphant as she explained that the county had finally agreed to condemn the problematic portion of my property under eminent domain. The land would be seized for community improvement purposes and converted into a luxury pool complex that would serve the residents of Willowbrook Estates. The legal papers were already filed, the contractors were already hired, and the destruction would begin immediately. Patricia handed me an envelope containing the condemnation notice and a check for what the county assessor had determined was fair market value for my orchard. The amount was insulting. Barely enough to cover the legal fees I had already spent fighting their harassment campaign. I watched in numb horror as the bulldozers roared to life and began their assault on my family's legacy. Trees that had stood for over a century were pushed over like weeds, their ancient roots torn from soil that had nourished them through decades of drought, flood, and storm. The sound of splintering wood and grinding machinery was like a physical blow to my chest. My wife, Sarah, stood beside me with tears streaming down her face as 4 generations of careful cultivation were destroyed in a matter of hours. The heritage apple varieties that my grandfather had grafted by hand, the irrigation channels that my father had maintained with such pride, the very soul of our farm, all of it disappeared beneath the relentless advance of yellow metal and corporate greed. By evening, 15 acres of productive orchard had been reduced to a scarred wasteland of broken stumps and churned earth. Patricia Thornfield surveyed the destruction with obvious satisfaction before climbing into her luxury SUV and driving back to her climate-controlled mansion. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Chapter 6. The Plan. I spent the following week in what appeared to be defeated resignation, but I was actually conducting the most important research of my life. Using county records, geological surveys, and old engineering reports, I mapped out every detail of the water system that my great-grandfather had created more than a century ago. The diversion structure itself was a masterpiece of 19th-century engineering, hidden beneath decades of accumulated sediment and vegetation. Samuel Hartwell had built a series of stone and timber gates that could redirect Miller's Creek's flow with nothing more than manual labor and basic tools. The system had operated so smoothly for so long that even I had forgotten how sophisticated it really was. More importantly, I discovered that the water flowing through Willowbrook Estates wasn't just used for their landscaping and decorative features. The entire development relied on my family's water diversion for everything from their swimming pools to their irrigation systems. The luxury homes, the perfectly manicured lawns, the elaborate fountain in their community center, all of it depended on water that legally belonged to my farm. I consulted with a water rights attorney who specialized in territorial-era agreements, and he confirmed what I had suspected. The HOA's destruction of my orchard had violated the terms of the original Water Rights Compact. Under territorial law, I was not only permitted to restore the creek to its natural course, I was legally required to do so. The attorney also pointed out something that made me smile for the first time in weeks. Because Willowbrook Estates had been built without proper research into the area's water rights history, their entire development was technically illegal. They had no legal claim to the water they had been using, and no legal recourse if that water suddenly disappeared. I began planning my response with the same careful attention to detail that my ancestors had used to build their irrigation system. This wouldn't be an act of revenge. It would be a restoration of the natural order that had existed long before Patricia Thornfield and her HOA had ever heard of this valley. The only question was timing. Chapter 7. Preparing for change. The construction of the pool complex proceeded with typical suburban efficiency, transforming my former orchard into an elaborate aquatic playground that would have impressed a Roman emperor. The HOA spared no expense, installing Olympic-sized swimming pools, elaborate water features, and a sophisticated filtration system that required enormous amounts of fresh water to operate. I watched the construction from my kitchen window, noting every detail of their water infrastructure. The complex was designed to be a showcase of luxury and excess, with multiple pools operating at different temperatures, decorative fountains that ran continuously, and landscaping that would require constant irrigation to maintain its artificial perfection. Patricia Thornfield held a press conference to celebrate the project, describing it as a transformative addition to our community that will enhance property values and quality of life for all residents. She made a point of mentioning how much better the land looked now that it was being put to appropriate use, instead of being wasted on outdated agricultural practices. While the HOA celebrated their victory, I was quietly preparing for the restoration of Miller's Creek to its original course. This required careful planning and precise timing, because I wanted to ensure that the change would be permanent and legally unassailable. I hired a team of environmental engineers to assess the ecological impact of returning the creek to its natural path. Their report confirmed that the restoration would actually benefit the local ecosystem by re-establishing wetland habitats that had been disrupted by the original diversion. This gave me additional legal protection and moral justification for what I was about to do. I also consulted with hydrologists to understand exactly how the water flow would change once the diversion was removed. Their calculations showed that Miller's Creek would reclaim its original channel within 2 to 3 weeks, creating a year-round water feature that would flow directly through the heart of Willowbrook Estates. The final piece of preparation involved documenting everything with photographs, videos, and official surveys. I wanted a complete record of the current situation before I made any changes, both for legal protection and for my own satisfaction. By late spring, everything was ready. Chapter 8. The Restoration. On a warm Tuesday morning in May, exactly 6 months after the destruction of my orchard, I walked down to the old diversion structure that my great-grandfather had built in 1889. The stone and timber gates were still there, hidden beneath decades of accumulated debris and overgrown vegetation, waiting patiently for someone who understood their purpose. I had spent weeks carefully cleaning and preparing the mechanism, oiling the ancient hinges, and testing the manual controls that Samuel Hartwell had designed with such ingenious simplicity. The system was built to last, constructed from materials that would endure for centuries if properly maintained. The actual process of restoring Miller's Creek to its natural course was surprisingly simple. I opened the gates that had directed water through my property for over a century, then closed the channels that had fed the irrigation system. Within hours, the creek began to remember its original path, following the subtle contours of land that had been shaped by thousands of years of natural flow. I documented every step of the process with photographs and video, creating a permanent record of the restoration for legal and historical purposes. The water rights attorney had advised me to be completely transparent about what I was doing, since I was acting within my legal rights under the Territorial Water Compact. The change wasn't immediately dramatic. Water systems have their own momentum, and it takes time for a creek to fully reclaim its original channel. But by the end of the first week, I could see clear signs that Miller's Creek was returning to the path it had followed before my great-grandfather's intervention. The flow through Willowbrook Estates began as a trickle, then gradually increased as the creek carved its way through soil that had been artificially dried for more than a century. The water was crystal clear and surprisingly cold, fed by mountain springs that had been flowing since long before the first European settlers arrived in the valley. I spent those first few days sitting on my porch, watching the restoration unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. I was undoing the work of my ancestors, but I was also honoring their deeper legacy of living in harmony with the natural world. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. The first sign that Willowbrook Estates was experiencing water pressure issues came when Patricia Thornfield's perfectly manicured lawn began turning brown despite the automated sprinkler system running continuously. Within a week, the decorative fountains in the community center were reduced to pathetic dribbles, and the elaborate pool complex was struggling to maintain proper water levels. I received my first angry phone call from Patricia on a Thursday morning, her voice shrill with panic and accusation. She demanded to know what I had done to sabotage their water supply, threatening legal action and claiming that I was somehow responsible for their infrastructure problems. I listened politely to her tirade, then calmly explained that I had simply restored Miller's Creek to its natural course, as required by the Territorial Water Rights Agreement that predated her subdivision by more than a century. I offered to provide her with copies of the historical documents and suggested that she consult with a water rights attorney. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. Patricia had clearly never considered the possibility that her community's water supply might not be legally secure. Like most suburban developers, she had assumed that water was simply a utility that could be purchased and controlled like electricity or natural gas. Over the following days, the situation in Willowbrook Estates deteriorated rapidly. The pool complex, which required thousands of gallons of fresh water daily to operate, became a series of expensive concrete basins filled with increasingly stagnant and algae-covered water. The elaborate landscaping began to wither and die, revealing the artificial nature of the suburban paradise that had been imposed on the natural landscape. Property owners began demanding answers from the HOA, and Patricia found herself in the uncomfortable position of explaining how she had led them into a legal and financial disaster. The community that had once prided itself on excluding undesirable agricultural activities was now facing the reality that their entire lifestyle had been dependent on a farm they had worked so hard to destroy. Emergency meetings were called, lawyers were consulted, and frantic attempts were made to secure alternative water sources. But the damage was already done, both literally and figuratively. Chapter 10. Consequences. The legal and financial fallout from the water crisis hit Willowbrook estates like a tsunami. Property values plummeted as word spread about the community's precarious water situation, and several homeowners filed lawsuits against the HOA for failing to properly research the water rights situation before approving the pool complex construction. Patricia Thornfield found herself at the center of a perfect storm of litigation, with angry residents demanding compensation for their losses and contractors seeking payment for work performed on a project that could no longer function as designed. The pool complex, which had cost over $2 million to build, became a monument to the dangers of ignoring local history and environmental realities. I watched the chaos unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sympathy. While I felt vindicated by the restoration of my family's water rights, I took no pleasure in seeing ordinary homeowners suffer for the mistakes of their HOA leadership. Many of the residents were decent people who had simply wanted a nice place to live and had trusted their elected representatives to make sound decisions. The environmental impact of the creek's restoration was overwhelmingly positive. Wildlife that had been absent from the area for decades began returning to the restored wetland habitat. Birds, amphibians, and aquatic insects flourished in the renewed ecosystem, creating a natural paradise that was far more beautiful than any artificial landscaping. Local environmental groups hailed the restoration as a victory for ecological sanity, and I found myself being interviewed by newspapers and television stations about the importance of respecting natural water systems. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of suburban sprawl and the value of preserving agricultural heritage. Meanwhile, my own property began to recover from the trauma of the orchard's destruction. I used the insurance settlement and condemnation payment to plant new fruit trees, choosing varieties that would be more resilient to climate change and better adapted to the restored water system. The irony was not lost on me that the land was now more valuable and productive than it had been before the HOA's intervention. By forcing me to modernize and diversify, they had inadvertently helped me create a more sustainable and profitable farming operation. Chapter 11. Resolution. The final resolution of the Willowbrook Estates water crisis took nearly 2 years to negotiate, involving multiple lawsuits, environmental assessments, and complex agreements between various parties. In the end, the community was forced to acknowledge my family's superior water rights and negotiate a formal agreement for limited water access. The terms of the settlement were favorable to my interests while providing the HOA with enough water to maintain basic operations. They were allowed to tap into Miller's Creek for essential residential needs, but the elaborate pool complex and decorative water features were permanently shut down. The community would have to learn to live within their means, both financially and environmentally. Patricia Thornfield resigned from the HOA presidency in disgrace and eventually moved away from the area entirely. Her replacement was a retired engineer named Robert Chen, who approached me with genuine respect and a desire to establish a positive relationship between our properties. Robert understood that the conflict had been unnecessary and destructive for everyone involved. He worked with me to develop a comprehensive water-sharing agreement that protected my historical rights while providing his community with reliable access to essential water supplies. The new relationship was based on mutual respect and recognition of our shared dependence on the natural environment. The pool complex was eventually converted into a community garden, with individual plots available to residents who wanted to try their hand at growing their own food. I provided advice and assistance to the novice gardeners, sharing the agricultural knowledge that my family had accumulated over 4 generations. Some of the former HOA critics became my strongest supporters, recognizing the value of having a working farm in their neighborhood. They appreciated the fresh produce, the educational opportunities for their children, and the connection to the land that suburban life often lacks. The transformation of Willowbrook Estates from an exclusive enclave to a more sustainable community became a model for other developments facing similar challenges. Environmental groups and urban planners studied our situation as an example of how traditional agriculture and modern residential development could coexist beneficially. Chapter 12. Lessons learned. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the importance of understanding and protecting historical rights, especially in an era of rapid development and environmental change. My great-grandfather's water diversion system had seemed like a quaint relic of the past, but it turned out to be the key to preserving our family's legacy and protecting the natural environment. I also learned that conflict doesn't have to be permanent or destructive if both parties are willing to approach problems with respect and open minds. The initial hostility between my farm and Willowbrook Estates was based on misunderstanding and poor communication rather than fundamental incompatibility. The restoration of Miller's Creek became a source of pride for the entire valley, demonstrating that environmental restoration and economic development could work together rather than in opposition. The creek now supports a thriving ecosystem while providing sustainable water resources for both agricultural and residential use. My relationship with the Willowbrook Estates community evolved from antagonistic to collaborative, with regular joint projects and shared resources. We established a farmers market in their community center, educational programs for local schools, and conservation initiatives that benefited the entire watershed. The legal precedent established by our water rights case has been cited in similar disputes across the region, helping other agricultural families protect their historical claims against encroaching development. Environmental lawyers now regularly reference the Hartwell decision when advising clients about territorial-era water rights. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to adapt it to present circumstances rather than simply preserving it unchanged. My great-grandfather's water system continues to serve its original purpose while also supporting new uses that he never could have imagined. The farm is now more productive and sustainable than ever before, combining traditional agricultural practices with modern environmental science. We've become a demonstration site for sustainable farming techniques, hosting visitors from around the world who want to learn about integrating agriculture with natural water systems. Chapter 13. New Beginnings. Today, 5 years after the restoration of Miller's Creek, my farm has become something my great-grandfather never could have envisioned but would certainly have approved of. The orchard has been replanted with heritage varieties that are better adapted to changing climate conditions, and the restored water system supports not just agriculture, but an entire ecosystem that benefits the whole community. The relationship with Willowbrook Estates has evolved into a genuine partnership, with shared resources and collaborative projects that benefit everyone involved. Their community garden produces enough fresh vegetables to supply a weekly farmers market, and many residents have become skilled gardeners under my guidance. Robert Chen and I have become close friends, bonding over our shared interest in sustainable development and environmental restoration. He often jokes that the water crisis was the best thing that ever happened to his community, forcing them to abandon their artificial lifestyle and reconnect with the natural world. The creek itself has become a focal point for the entire valley, supporting wildlife populations that had been absent for decades and providing recreational opportunities for families throughout the region. Children from both my farm and the subdivision spend their summers exploring the restored wetlands and learning about the interconnections between human activity and natural systems. I've started offering educational tours of the farm, explaining the history of the water system and demonstrating sustainable agricultural practices to visitors from schools, universities, and environmental organizations. The story of our conflict and resolution has become a case study in environmental law schools and planning programs across the country. My own children, who had seemed destined to leave farming for more lucrative careers, have returned to help manage the expanded operation. They bring fresh ideas and modern technology while respecting the traditional knowledge that has sustained our family for over a century. The farm now generates income from multiple sources: traditional agriculture, educational programs, agri-tourism, and consulting services for other communities facing similar development pressures. We've proven that small-scale agriculture can be both economically viable and environmentally beneficial when properly integrated with surrounding communities. Thank you for listening to my story of how an old water rights agreement and some 19th century engineering helped me turn the tables on a hostile HOA. I hope it demonstrates that sometimes the best solutions to modern problems can be found in the wisdom of the past, and that cooperation usually works better than conflict. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about the intersection of agriculture, environment, and community development. Until next time, remember that water always finds its way back to where it belongs.